Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of It Takes a Village podcast. I'm super excited with my next guest, going back to the educational side of things. Ms. Shane Safir, hailing from Oakland, California, has done a lot of work in BC, across the world, really. Has now a third book called Pedagogies of Voice. First book was The Listening Leader, followed up by Street Data. Shane, welcome to another episode.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to reconnect, Dan.
We've done some work together, but I want to pull back the curtain on who Shane is, because I think a lot of people know your name and some of the work that you've done, but I don't really know if they know who Shane is. And can you tell us a bit about your upbringing and how you came to be?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm here in my home in Oakland, California this morning. And actually, I'm sort of a fifth generation Oaklander. My great grandparents immigrated from Ireland to the city, and my great grandmother, who I knew until I was 25, was born and raised here through the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 and all the, before there was a Bay Bridge, all the eras of the 20th century. And I myself grew up in the South Bay, in a suburban area, and I'm a product of California public schools. And really I'm sort of an accidental teacher. That wasn't my career by design. I worked in the juvenile prison system in Rhode Island during college and was very passionate about juvenile defense and wanted to become an attorney at the time. Took a couple of years off after undergrad, worked in a couple different civil rights and social work contexts, and then thought, well, I don't know if I'm ready for law school. I guess I'll try my hand at teaching for a couple years. That was 1996, 97 when I pursued an education, a master's in education. And here I am, more than 25 years later, never left it, just fell madly in love with teaching, with pedagogy, with the ideas that still really animate the work I do around student voice and student identity and helping young people become. And I guess I would say a lot of that probably comes out of my own experiences as a kid growing up and just experiences of really seeking belonging, not always finding that for different reasons, whether that was, having a queer identity or, a lot of different sort of family challenges and traumas. I think I've just been on this lifelong quest to create spaces of belonging and radical inclusion for young people that I didn't feel and have, despite kind of like performing on the standard metrics, which we might talk about with my second book.
Mm-hmm.
I was pretty alienated as a young person and really struggled a lot. So I think that's just a bit about, and then maybe I'll just add that I'm, the mom now. I'm a boy mom of 17 and 20-year-old young men, and parenting them through the pandemic and now, Trump 2.0 and the sort of moment we're in has been a lot, and also continues to really be inflected, I think, in my work.
And you've expanded your work into my neck of the woods, BC. You've expanded to other parts of the world as well. Can you get into how all that started?
Yeah, the origin story of that is kind of interesting. So in 2019, I think it was April or May, there was a convening in Cowichan Bay on Vancouver Island of the Deeper Learning Dozen, which Abbotsford School District, you were probably there at the time, was a part of. And that was 12 districts, obviously, about 3 or 4 of them from BC and the rest from the States, led by Jal Mehta from Harvard University and some other colleagues of his. And I was asked to come and give a talk on The Listening Leader, my first book. I gave that talk, but I also was so privileged to participate in this cultural connections experience led by our late elder Tusi George, who became a good friend of mine, and other folks from the Hokuminam community there. And just sort of leaned into being a part of this district transformation network, these conversations about systems change, and then the local knowledge and kind of protocols around how do we understand colonization? How do we understand it not just as a conceptual force, but as an embodied experience that really infects and affects everything about how we move in the world? And from there, my work just started to organically grow. I started building connections, relationships, being invited into different districts. It grew at one point into the ministry where they were hosting a data and evidence community of practice around street data that I led for 2 years. We had about 18 different districts go through that. And I've been so lucky to kind of build these connections and relationships and be able to move across the province in different ways.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I want to get into a little bit about the granular side of things, about what student voice is. Like we hear that term a ton, and it's referenced a lot in your work. What does it actually mean to you?
I'm glad you asked me that because it made me dig into the third book, Pedagogies of Voice, which shout out to my co-authors and family, Marla Bugseek, Crystal Watson, and Susan Jabber, who helped me with this book. And we talked about this in the middle of the book. We said we invite you to think of student voice expansively, including oral, nonverbal, written, artistic, play-based, musical, three-dimensional, and other forms of self-expression. And also just want to mention that student voice, it's like, a component of student agency, which is really the bigger idea inside both street data and POV, pedagogies of voice, which is essentially the idea that when we provide healthy learning conditions for young people, they have the capacity to, act independently, to engage in dialogue, to apply their learning to the real world, to design and carry out original ideas and to take informed action. There's a lot more to say about that, but I think student voice, sometimes it gets stripped down to just this really like perfunctory idea of hearing what a kid has to say. But I think we're trying to weave it into something much bigger, which is like change, societal change, educational change,
Yeah.
action.
And was there a moment that you kind of talked about it earlier? Was there a moment in your career or personal experiences that you felt adults weren't listening to students or youth in general?
It's such a good question. And it's easy. When you wrote this question to me, I thought it's so easy to externalize it and blame like the system. And I'm sure there are many times where I failed to listen to kids too. And that's part of it. But what is coming to mind for me right now is my earliest teaching experience. Balboa High School was a large comprehensive high school in San Francisco. That experience, I was there for 4 years. I helped to create like a small learning community within that big school called the Law Academy. And I developed really deep relationships with those kids, so much so that I'm still connected to several of them. Um, One of them is just getting married for the first time at 43, and we were texting, and it was pretty cool. When I think about that school environment, I mean, the kids were so brilliant. They were almost all first generation to college. They were almost all students of color.
Hmm.
And they were, like so many marginalized young people, they were really underestimated. And I remember trying to double code my history course as honors and quote unquote regular and allowed the young people to choose which pathway they wanted because we were doing really rigorous reading and writing. Um, and I was told by the assistant principal at the time, I'm sorry, but your students they're not accelerated enough to have an honors option. And I remember that just like hitting me like a ton of bricks and feeling this sadness that their genius was really invisible. Uh, so I don't know if it's so much about listening in the traditional sense, but like on a macro sense, right? The abundance, the potential, the capacity, the brilliance of young people just felt like it was so often missed or made invisible in these
Hmm.
systems.
My next question is about how do students genuinely feel heard? And I'm going to give you an example recently that I had. We had some kids who were part of a student advocacy project, and they were comparing girls' locker rooms to boys' locker rooms. And it was actually the female was saying, that there's a lot of inequities with the boys' locker room. There isn't single stalls for students to change or shower, whereas the girls, they all have individual stalls, etc. And I brought that forward, up the ranks, and it went so far as the assistant superintendent. They're like, and the district health and safety team. And they're like, yeah, you know what, we're going to look at this because we feel that this is an inequity. So, leading into my question, is that an example of students feeling genuinely heard, or is there other examples or things that you can think of?
I think it's a great example in terms of school policy decision making, and street data over time has become, it feels like, kind of a framework and a mechanism for often for changing and shifting school culture, policy, and governance. And I think other examples that come to mind are more classroom level, which is the sequel, the Pedagogies of Voice. How do we center student voices to transform daily learning experiences?
Hmm.
And what comes to mind today as I think about that question is, the idea of making learning public, of creating audience, right, for young people's voices and work, and inviting them to develop different products of their learning, artifacts of their learning, whether it's, TED Talks, as I got to work on this year with my colleague Carl at Berkeley High, or Sosan Jaber's student work is profiled in our book a lot, and a lot of it is, videos and presentations and even conferences that our students put on. I used to do mock trials and moot court and what do you call it, mock congress. There's so many ways to create authenticity and real world application. But I think when young people feel that sense of like, my voice isn't just this, ancillary thing, it's actually central to the learning. It's what gives the learning substance and meaning. It does something transformative to them.
Hmm. What talk about school culture a little bit. How do we have students feel like they belong rather than comply? I know there's a
Mm.
bit of a difference there, but
Yeah, it's a great question. The belonging chapter of Pedagogies of Voice talks about two pedagogies we can enact and design around in order to foster belonging. One of them is circle pedagogy, or what I call circle up, first in street data and then in POV. And the other is radical inclusion, which Leighton Schneller, who you probably know, helped to contribute to that chapter through like a disability justice lens. And I think, as simple as it sounds, I think really challenging ourselves to organize our learning spaces into circles where young people can see each other and feel a sense of egalitarianism, where everybody has a voice, right? And as
hmm,
as Perry Smith, who used to
hmm,
be an Outford, taught me, like, there's no hierarchy. Even the
hmm,
teacher sits in the circle, right? It's like this disciplined structure for listening that I feel like moves us closer to belonging or creates the conditions for belonging. So that's one thing. I also think the piece about identity and really, really welcoming all of who young people are through what we call storyintation in the book, through storytelling, through sharing. Just the pieces of who we are and where we come from is so important. And that can happen in the classroom, but it can also happen through different ceremonies and rituals at a school-wide level, right?
hmm,
And
hmm.
I feel like when young people walk into a building, ideally we want them to see themselves reflected back in the adults, on the walls, in the ceremony, ritual, events, that they feel a part of the community in a really meaningful way.
And I know, in my role, a lot of administrators will make decisions, and even school policy talked about earlier at district level, but a lot of decisions are made based on data that's gathered through test scores, et cetera. What are we missing when we focus too much on some of that data?
I mean, I think that data tends to perpetuate a single story of achievement and success. Um, the data itself is not always, you know, clear and I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. It's not always valid if young people are sort of disengaged or anxious or bubbling in, ever random answers on a test score sheet. And I think that who we are in the world is so much more qualitative in a sense than quantitative. It's so much more layered and nuanced. And when we only look at numbers, right? When we don't use numbers as a guidepost to kind of dig deeper and uncover root causes and hidden narratives, we really narrow the story we're telling about young people. And I think grades is one way that that plays out. Test scores is another. Even attendance, I mean, I don't know if you remember that panel we did years ago in Abbey where the young woman talked about why she wasn't going to school.
Hmm.
And she had dealt with so much trauma and it was such a struggle just to get to school. So we look at the numbers, we're like, oh, X, Y, or Z student or student group is not attending school. And we wring our hands about that. But do we understand the story, the reason why young people are making that choice? Because they do have agency, right? Every day to decide, I want to be here or I don't. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but
No, it for sure does. And kind of leading into my next question, is there a specific story or situation that you can highlight?
in terms of,
Just changing your perspective on education in general or the system. Is there a success story from a student that you can pull out?
oh my goodness.
I'm sure there's lots, but
I was thinking of not of the opposite of a success. Do you want a success story? Let me think about that. Um,
well, I mean, answer how you like. If there's something that you feel that we need to highlight, then absolutely.
I'll tell you one of each. So the success story, we'll go back to the student I mentioned earlier. My student Alondra I had her in my class 1997 to 99. This is a long time ago. She had been kicked out of her previous high school for behavioral issues, for speaking back and flashing on the teacher and all these things. And
Mm,
she came to my school, she was put in my class, and she was super sassy, lots of attitude. And immediately I was like, this kid is brilliant, so smart. And I just loved her and we connected. And over time, she became just a superstar in the Law Academy program. And our program had a partnership with the San Francisco Bar Association where they funded a college tour. So I got to take Alondra and a bunch of students on a trip to Washington, D.C. We visited many colleges, actually New York City too, including Howard University, which is a historically Black college in the States. And Alondra ended up going to Howard to study social work, getting her master's in social work. And now she's like thriving in this career. And I just think about, what was happening at her previous high school that her, way of showing up and expressing herself, her genius was not only like, not valued, it was like, um, problematized, right? It was created into a problem. And
mm,
and how just a shift in context of a new program, a new curriculum, a new pedagogy, and a group of teachers that really loved her like made a big difference and opened up pathways. So that comes to mind and feels exciting. Um, and then I also think of a story that I wrote for Pedagogies of Voice that got cut as we had to cut words about a time where I really failed a student. And I think that I had a perception of this is a ninth grader I was teaching in East Oakland. I had a perception of the student that he didn't want to be in my class, that there was some like gender stuff and he just like wasn't connecting with me or wasn't having a lot of respect for me. And I thought he'd do better in a male colleague's class. And so we ended up moving him. And as I thought back on that story over time, and I thought about a couple moments where I asked him to read out loud in class, which in retrospect was not the best idea, I realized that he was struggling with just these profound literacy gaps. And I, as a high school teacher, had not been taught really anything about literacy instruction. I didn't know how to address literacy gaps. And my job was actually to learn how to do that and to sit side by side with this young man and help him figure out how to become a proficient reader. And rather than take responsibility for that and be vulnerable and say, I don't know how to do this, I need help, I created a story about, oh, he just needs another person. And so, yeah, I think it can happen both ways, right? We all have stories of where we've really succeeded with kids and stories of where we failed kids. And hopefully we get to learn from both of those.
mhm. I had Myron Duick. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but I had him on the podcast, and we were kind of talking about what success means for students. And oftentimes we see these high flyer students, 95, 99 percenters. They leave no problem, but maybe they don't necessarily have some of the soft skills or um, those things that we kind of miss the mark in learning about who they are and what they need from the system, because it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be successful post grad. But I kind of want to ask you, what would you define success for students as? Is it having some of those resiliency skills, the curiosity? What are some of the things that you need or you would like to see that students would need when they graduate?
Listen, this being human thing is really difficult. And in
Mm.
some ways, I feel like I would define success for students the same way I would define success for adults, which is it's an ongoing, evolving, lifelong quest to come into your own, to come into your voice, to come into your sense of purpose. At 53, I feel like I might be a little bit closer than I was at 17, but I'm not there. Like I haven't
Mm,
arrived.
mhm,
Every day I'm wrestling with like, who do I want to be in this phase of life? And what is my purpose? And how do I stand in that?
mhm,
So the agency framework, which was first introduced in Street Data Chapter 5 and now is like the kind of like animating force behind Pedagogies of Voice, that was sort of my attempt to encapsulate a more spacious vision of student success. And so to say that if young people feel a strong sense of identity, that who they are, all parts of themselves, their ways of knowing and being and learning are valued, if they feel a sense of identity, that they're known and seen and loved, if they feel a sense of mastery in street data, but we shifted that in pedagogies of voice to inquiry. So, an
mhm,
ability to really ask critical questions of the world, to your point, to be curious and have that be embraced, and to demonstrate their understanding. And then finally, of efficacy, an ability to just make a difference around things that matter to them. That would be pretty good. And that we need assessments and we need data that helps us measure those things, not just, kind of foundational skills. Yes, that really matters, but also identity, belonging, inquiry, and efficacy.
So looking at, like I said, post grad, what are some of are those the skills that students you feel will need for success in the real world, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed with my colleague Alcine Mumby on our podcast, Street Data Pod, Dr. Linda Darling Hammond, the state board president in California. And she was like, "Listen, what job do you have in the real world that says here's 5 answers? Like, choose one and bubble it in." Right? I
Mhm,
think young
mhm,
people need the skills of communication. They need to know how to collaborate. They need the skills of reflection and revision, which is one of the 8 pedagogies in POV. So, like, how do you iterate on something? How do you take in feedback and not personalize it, but actually use it to improve?
mhm,
And I think that they also really need those kind of critical literacy skills of interrogating the media they receive, right? Interrogating and asking questions of the world, the society, their politicians, all the things.
mhm.
Um, and then, of course, I'm, kind of live in the creative side of things. I think they need creative skills too, the ability to generate new ideas, innovations, products, art.
For one more question, kind of
Yeah.
about you before we get into what I like to call rapid fire questions. But if you were to look back on your own journey, through all the books, all the work that you've done in all these different districts, would you change anything? Would you alter your approach, or do you feel like you've been successful personally?
Hmm. Oof. That's a very deep question. Um, I have a hard time slowing down to feel and celebrate success. I think I'm a seeker and a striver, so I'm always trying to like do more, give more, enact and support people more. And that can be a little bit of a trap where you're like, wait a minute. I found
Mm,
out Street Data has sold over 117,000 copies across the globe. POV is almost at 10,000 in year one, which is its first marker. And I kind of tear up thinking about that because it's like there's all these seeds out there that I don't even know most of these humans who've read this work and who maybe were touched by it or maybe tried to enact some of the ideas. And that's very humbling. I'm sitting in my office where I wrote these books and, you just don't know where your work's going to go. So
mhm,
I guess I could say I think that there's been impact and reach of these projects, and that feels really beautiful. And both things can be true. I still push myself. I still want to figure out, well, what's missing, right? Like how to mostly I'm like a practitioner writer, right? So I'm always thinking about like how to translate these concepts into action and
Mm-hmm.
tools and things that people can do. And right now our team for POV is really working on that. Like what's the curriculum that helps teachers and coaches and admin really like awaken student voice in every classroom. And I would say the last thing I'll add to this is I'm thinking about pursuing a PhD or an EDD in the next few years. My younger
Mm,
kids graduating from high school. And what I've been like intuiting recently that I might want to write about may interest you, which is I think I want to compare one or two BC districts to one or two California districts and take this lens of like, what are the leadership and systems conditions that make it possible to move toward a pedagogy of voice and student voice and agency? How do we not? We know that classrooms exist everywhere,
uh-huh.
right? That look and feel like this, but how do we think about that on a system scale? And what can we learn by studying two very different contexts?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just going to add to that. As you were talking, I'm like, that's such a great idea because I mean, I'm a firm believer in getting outside of the brick and mortar four walls of the classroom. I think you going back to your inquiry piece, I think students would see a ton of success from a curiosity and inquiry side of things by being outside, for example, or just switching up the structure of how courses are run, regardless of the course. It could be math, but I'm a huge proponent of that. And I actually, I mean, I would encourage you to do that because I'm very interested to see how those results would be. Going from the south to how things are working up here in the north. Right? I think we could learn a lot from each other. So. Um, Going
Thank you.
into the kind of the rapid fire questions for you. Before we give you the last word, uh, who is somebody that you feel everyone should listen to or read about other than yourself?
um, I always lift up Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a writer, podcaster, organizer, just an ethereal human being, singer. I love her podcast, How to Survive the End of the World, I think it's called, with her sister Autumn Brown. I love her writing, including the central text I've used a lot is called Emergent Strategy. And I'm also a huge fan of Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, who just published a book called The Archaeology of Self. I've been following her for a long time, and we've become friends and colleagues. And I just think she's like the absolute embodiment of what she calls critical love, and I think of as radical love from Bell Hooks' work. Somebody who's so sharp and smart and brilliant and like moves with so much love and care for other people. And I just admire her so much. And her book, if you want to put it in the show notes, is definitely worth people getting their hands on.
Hmm. Okay. And is that your favorite podcast or author to listen to, or who do you like to follow?
For podcaster, I would say the Adrienne Marie Brown
Yeah.
podcast
Okay.
is a go-to for me. Yeah,
Okay.
I really like it.
And then what is your favorite pastime down there in Oakland or anywhere, wherever you are?
I have a lot of different pastimes, but I would say the top of my list is probably cooking.
Oh,
That's, of course, a sort of vehicle for creativity for me. My boys, they're growing boys and they love my food. And so I get a lot of, I put a lot of love into the food I cook for them. And then I get a lot of love back when they're like, Mom, this is so great. I don't want to go to a restaurant. I just want to eat here. I'm like, oh,
well, Shane, if you created your own cookbook, I think I would purchase it. I would love to see.
interesting idea.
Yeah, maybe that could be maybe an appendix as part of your next book.
I love that. That's brilliant. Great idea.
Okay, you kind of talked about it earlier, but your hopes and dreams for yourself in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, it's funny with these books, people often will write to me and say, Dr. Safir. And I'm like, I'm not a doctor. Like, I
Mm,
haven't done that. But I've been teaching students and adults for a long time, and I feel very called toward becoming a student again and allowing myself that gift of knowledge and learning at the feet of others. And so right now I'm feeling really driven to pursue a doctorate. and maybe
Okay.
teach in higher ed.
Yeah. Okay. And I should have asked you this earlier, given the theme of the podcast, "It Takes a Village." But who was or who are your mentors?
Um, Deborah Meyer is a really important mentor. She's 95. We still talk. She called me yesterday pretty frequently, and she was one of the founders of a series of small public schools in New York City that thrived, where kids, young people, first generation of college young people were getting into college at very high rates and doing performance-based assessment and inquiry pedagogy and all these things. So she's also a leftist, Jewish person of Jewish descent, and that is a big part of my heritage. So just somebody that I really look up to.
Hmm.
Other than Debbie, my mentors, I would say also my editor, who's also of Jewish descent. Interestingly, and there's a theme here. My retired editor from Street Data, Dan Alpert, is a wonderful, wonderful human being. Shares a name with you, and an absolutely brilliant and generous editor, and I think has made me such a better writer and communicator, and is always somebody I can call when I need support or to think through and strategize around things. So the two of them stand out.
Okay. I love that. Thank you. And then before we sign off, I want to give you the final word. What is something that people, our listeners, can take away, or any sage advice that you want to leave us with?
Well, you asked me the question in the notes, a book every educator should read, and I am most of the way through Braiding Sweetgrass right now by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a botanist, a plant biologist, and um, a member of the Potawatomi, I hope I'm saying that right, First Nation. And I think it's making me think a lot about not just what we can learn from nature and studying the natural world and its patterns and rhythms, but what does reciprocity mean and look like um, in our school systems, in our family systems, in our relationship to the land, in our pedagogical choices? How do we model and really teach this idea of reciprocity that's sitting with me in a certain way right now?
Okay. And then finally, sorry, how can people follow you, if they want to get more information about not only who you are, but some of the work that you have done?
Yeah, so I'm fairly active on Instagram at Shane Safir _author. I am fairly active on LinkedIn, which is just my name at Shane Safir. And then our team built a really beautiful website, pedagogiesofvoice.com, which I would recommend people go on, which has, bios and booking forms and things like that, but also some of the tools from the book. Um, and yeah, I'm pretty easy to reach. I try to
Okay.
be accessible.
And you have your own podcast, is that right?
I do. We've done 6 seasons. We are pondering a hiatus for the next year.
Okay.
But that's a great point. Streetdata.podbean.com, and Street Data Pod is on all channels, Apple, Spotify, etc. And we have, 30 something, maybe even 40 episodes of free content now that's linked to this concept of street data and the student voice.
Okay. Well, I just want to give you my immense gratitude because some of the work that you shared with us, back in the Abbey School District and now in Langley School District, we've taken some of those things that you shared with us, and you've had a huge impact on not only my life but some of the students that we work with, and talking about success stories and moving things forward. Again, we're indebted to you because of the things that you showed us. So thank you so much for not only being on here, but for some of the work that you've done in impacting other people's, especially at-risk youth, lives. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I'm really glad you're doing this, and I appreciate the invitation.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's connect again in a little bit.
That sounds good. Thanks so much.